Chapter 2 is called Cognitive Neuroscience. So this chapter is really going to focus on what is happening in the brain as we process and have various experiences. So we'll start by discussing levels of analysis. So whenever we have an experience, a cognitive experience, we don't just experience that one experience from a single perspective. Our brain has to process and look at our experiences from multiple angles and different points of view. And it's from those different points of view and those different angles that can lead to understanding. So one thing that your book will talk about is Gil and Mary. So when they first encounter each other and they talk to each other, they are starting to perceive and develop an understanding of each other. Chemicals are being released that may, show that they are interested in one another from a romantic standpoint. And later, when they are apart, Gil, for example, will remember meeting Mary. He will start to process his feelings that he has, or those neurons that were firing when he first encountered Mary, and he will have pleasant feelings towards her. So levels of analysis say that we don't just examine a topic from a single perspective. There are multiple angles for how we mentally or cognitively experience things. So the field of cognitive neuroscience is the physiological basis of cognition. So we have to start thinking about the nervous system and what makes up the nervous system. And if you remember back to your Psychology 108 class, you know that a neuron is a cell that's specialized to create, receive, and transmit information throughout your nervous system to other neurons. And each neuron is going to have the same basic structure. There'll be a cell body, an axon, and dendrites. So let's take a look at what a simple neuron looks like. Here's an example of how they can be structured differently, but you can see the soma or cell body is that big part where you've got all of these organisms that whenever a message is received in from the dendrites, the cell body is what helps determine whether or not that message is healthy to continue to send throughout the body, because the dendrites are those sort of tree-like branches that take in the information to the cell body or soma, and then the cell body or soma sends the message down the axon, which is that long tube-filled part of the neuron. And of course, when the information is sent down the axon, it is transmitted through the terminal buttons to other neurons. So that is the basic building block of the nervous system. Our brain is composed of billions of these neurons that help us function. So when we think about the neurons, it's important to think about if there are billions of them, they form what we call a nerve net. This was kind of the early concept of how these neurons connect to each other. They connect as if a net, sort of like a highway system, where there are no stop signs, where things are always being transmitted. But eventually, that idea was contradicted by Cahal's idea of the neuron doctrine, which says that our individual nerve cells transmit signals, but they may not necessarily always be linked. When it comes to communication between neurons, neurons are able to communicate through what's called an action potential. So an action potential occurs when the neuron sends a signal from the environment and it travels down the axon and it continues to move. When neurons are communicating and when the message is being transmitted, it can occur at something called the synapse. And if you take a look at the picture, you can see that the synapse is sort of the gap or space between an axon of one neuron and a dendrite or cell body of another. So it's the space where the information is sent on. So when an action potential occurs, it reaches the end of the axon, and though the synaptic vessels open up, it releases those neurotransmitters, which are those chemicals, those body's natural chemicals that are constantly transmitted through the body, and they're able to go on to the receiving dendrite of another neuron. When it comes to how we can define the mind can be defined as a system that creates different representation of the world so we can act on it to achieve our goals. So everything a person experiences is based on representation in the person's nervous system. So when we have different experiences, those neurons continue to develop. Feature detectors are neurons that respond best to a specific stimulus. So there was lots of research done in the 1960s with cats to determine what these feature detectors are. And if you take a look at the picture, when it comes to feature detectors, these neurons that respond best to a specific stimulus, what this research showed us is that there are certain neurons, maybe in our visual system, that will respond to certain things and not other things. And those are known as feature detectors. As we grow, as we age, as we develop, the structure of the brain will change based on our experience. We already know that the brain is plastic, and experience-dependent plasticity says that our structure of our brain will change based on our experience. So with those studies with cats, the kittens who were exposed to vertical only stimuli over time, that was what they could perceive, because that's what they experienced for a long time. So this demonstrated to us that perception is determined by neurons that fire to specific qualities of a stimulus. There's also this idea of hierarchical processing. This is the idea that when we perceive different objects, we do so in a specific order that moves from lower areas of the brain to higher areas of the brain. And when that movement from lower to higher areas of the brain occurs, it corresponds to our ability to perceive objects from different ranges, from simple to higher level of complexity. So this idea of hierarchical processing says that when we perceive something, we do so from lower levels to higher levels in the brain. When it comes to how things are coded in our brain, there are different types of sensory coding that can occur. For example, there's specificity coding, which is when a stimulus is represented by the firing of specifically tuned neurons that are specialized to respond to only specific stimulus. So it's called specificity coding because it is specific to a certain stimulus. Population coding occurs when the representation of a stimulus occurs by the pattern of firing of a large number of neurons. So when it comes to population coding, we are now looking at which neurons in this area are going to fire. So it's going to be based on the population that is being affected. And then sparse coding occurs when only a small group of neurons are going to fire, and then the majority of them will remain silent. So sometimes that sparse coding occurs where only parts of the brain are activated and the other neurons in the brain remain silent. Again, if you take a look at this picture here, this is a good representation of the difference between specificity, population, and sparse coding. You can see with specificity coding, you have the firing of a specific neuron. With population coding, you can see that you're going to have a large number of neurons that are firing. And then with sparse coding, it's going to be some fire and then some don't. Localization of functioning occurs when specific functions are serviced by specific areas of the brain. So this is brain localization. So as we age, our cognitive functioning tends to decline in specific ways when certain other areas of the brain are damaged. There's been lots of research to show that as people age, cognitive functioning can decline. The cerebral cortex can contain mechanisms that are responsible for most of our cognitive functioning. So the idea is that cerebral cortex is not able to function in the way it always has the rest of your life. So when it comes to brain localization, there's one specific thing that we know is localized to specific areas of the brain, and that is language production. And Broca's area is a part of the frontal lobe, which is responsible for our ability to comprehend language and then also to engage in speech production. So if a person has damage to Broca's area, for example, maybe due to a stroke or something, some type of brain trauma, then they might have impaired language production. And although their language comprehension skills could be intact, but their production could be affected. Same way with Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is located in the temporal lobe of the brain, and damage to Wernicke's area can cause difficulty with language comprehension, whereas speech production is not impaired. If we continue to discuss localization of functioning, your occipital lobe is responsible for your visual cortex. The parietal lobe is responsible for your perception of touch and temperature and pain, whereas the temporal lobe is responsible for hearing, taste, and smell. And then the ability to coordinate all of your senses all of your executive functioning is responsible to the frontal lobe. If one area of the brain is damaged, it can cause functioning in another area to be impacted. So double dissociation is the idea that we can identify functions that are controlled by different parts of the brain. So some of the ways that we examine brain dysfunction is through brain imaging scans. Functional MRI is a good way to determine, what kind of neural activity is going on, how much oxygen is the brain getting. So many people who are experiencing any type of cognitive issue could have an MRI to determine whether or not there's decreased neural activity in the brain. There are also some other ways that we can look at how brain localization happens through imaging, through fusiform face area scanning, which responds to specific faces. Anytime a person has damage to that area of the brain, they may not be able to recognize a person's face, and they could know who the person is, but then they struggle with understanding, and they can't produce the person's name. And PPA responds specifically to places, indoor and outdoor spaces. And if that parahippocampal area in the brain is damaged, then that person may not recognize the indoor and outdoor areas. Same way with the EBA areas. This responds to specific pictures of bodies and parts of the body. If that's damaged, then people may not be able to recognize that. So the central principle of cognition says that most of our experience is multidimensional. So in addition to have localization of brain functioning, specific functions are processed by many different areas of the brain. So we can't just say that the temporal area is responsible for our perception of pain and assume that no other area could have that functioning. So sometimes for some, it seems like that is contradicting how the brain works. But really, we have to realize that these brain areas are complementary to each other and that they all work together. So here's the idea of neural networks, and it kind of shows you how the different areas of the brain are connected, how they can communicate with each other. You can see that these sort of networks and fibers are all over the place. And they have these nerve tracks that help the human brain determine and track imaging. Structural connectivity says that the brain's wiring diagram is created by axons that connect brain areas as unique to individuals as fingerprints, and all of our brain areas are unique to us. The idea of functional connectivity says that groups of neurons are sort of connected together and they can help us relate to different types of cognition. And all of this is determined by the amount of correlated neural activity that's happening in these various brain areas. There are 6 common functions that have been determined by resting state functional MRI scans. And those 6 areas are the visual, somomotor, the dorsal attention, the executive control, salience, and default mode. And the function of the visual network is for vision and vision perception through that occipital lobe. The somomotor area network is responsible for our ability to move and to touch things. The dorsal attention area is responsible for our attention to visual stimulus and then also spatial locations, while those executive control functionings in that frontal lobe are responsible for those higher level cognitive tasks that are involved in our working memory. And we'll talk more about that in chapter 5. And then also directing our attention to various tasks. We've got the salience network, which helps with attending to those survival relevant events in our environment. So those fight or flight instincts that kick in for us. And then the default mode has to do with mind wandering and cognitive ability related to our own personal life stories and social functioning and monitoring of internal emotional states. So these are the 6 common functions that these functional MRI scans have shown the brain areas are responsible for. So our cognitive ability can be very dynamic. The flow of activity within and across the brain's neural networks can change based on conditions. They can change within and across networks. And that sort of default mode network just says that the modes of the brain functioning, when it occurs, it's going to be at rest if it's in default mode, and it is one of the brain's largest networks. So that is chapter 2. I hope all of this help you understand a little bit more about what you read in the chapter.